So you're a software developer in a Java shop, and you frequently go MVN verify or MVN clean install to build your project. You ever wonder what goes on when you run those commands? Moreover, when someone comes up and says, just go MVN test. Well, how does that relate to what you've been doing? These are all portions of the Maven Build Lifecycle. Thank you for joining me on this video. Here I'm going to walk you through the Maven Build Lifecycle and how it relates to the commands you've been using. Then I'll walk you through what happens when you actually run those commands. So by the end of this video, you'll have an understanding of what goes on when you run those Maven commands and help you make a better, more productive software developer. So let's get started. MVN clean install, or maybe your team does an MVN verify. What's the difference? The arguments you provide to the MVN command, or the goals you specify in a run configuration in your IDE, tell Maven how much of the lifecycle to perform. There are 3 build lifecycles in Maven: the clean, the default lifecycle, and the site lifecycle. Each of these lifecycles consists of several phases. Now the default lifecycle, which is what you use most often when building a jar, a war, or an ear file, is made up of these phases: validate, compile, test, package, verify, install, and deploy. These are the main phases of the primary phases of the default lifecycle. There are others that are interspersed within here that we'll touch on in a few minutes. The clean lifecycle does just that. Cleans your project by deleting the /target folder, thus getting rid of all your compiled classes and resources and so forth. The site lifecycle is used to generate the project documentation. For example, the Maven documentation for the Maven project itself was generated using the site plugin. If this layout looks familiar to you from other projects you've seen, they probably use the Maven site plugin to generate it. So let's suppose you're building a jar file. Let's take a closer look at what happens when you do a Maven clean install. And here we're going to see some of those additional phases I mentioned earlier. So here I am in the serving web content project, and I'm just going to do an MVN clean install. And we see here that Maven is going to start by performing the clean lifecycle. And as I mentioned earlier, all that does is simply deletes your /target folder. What's going on here is Maven is executing the clean goal from the Maven clean plugin, version 3.2.0 of the clean plugin. Because there's nothing bound to the validate phase, nothing gets executed here. We'll come back to that. This build info goal from the Spring Boot Maven plugin, that is bound to the process resources phase. More on that later. Then we get to the resources phase, and Maven's going to execute the resources goal from the Maven resources plugin, and all that's going to do is copy your source main resources folder, the contents of that, over into target classes. Then the compile phase happens. And in this case, Maven's going to run the compile goal from the Maven compiler plugin. And that's going to compile all of the code, the source code files from your source main Java over into target classes. Similar things happen over on the test side. We get into the test resources phase. Maven's going to run the test resources goal from the Maven resources plugin, essentially copying source test resources over into target test classes. Similar thing with compiling your test code. It's going to run the test compile goal from the Maven compiler plugin and compile everything from source test Java and stick it into target test classes. Then we get to the test phase. So Maven's going to run the test goal from the Maven Surefire plugin, version 2.22.2. and run all of your tests. If those tests all passed, it then proceeds to the package phase. Because we're building a jar file, Maven's going to execute the jar goal from the Maven jar plugin. If we were making a war file, it would execute the war goal from the Maven war plugin. And that essentially is going to build the jar file over in the target folder from all the compiled classes. This repackaged goal from the Spring Boot Maven plugin is also bound to the package phase. All that does in this case is it rebuilds this jar file we just made by bringing in all of the dependencies, such as the servlet API, so that the jar file can be run from the command line. Java-jar serving web content 100 snapshot.jar. Finally, the install phase happens, and Maven's going to execute the install goal from the Maven install plugin. And all that is going to do is copy the jar file that you've created from the target folder over to your local Maven repository in your user home directory .m2 repository, package path / artifact ID, so on and so forth. And the same thing with the POM file. And Maven will stop there. It doesn't perform the deploy phase because we told it to simply stop at the install phase. What the deploy phase does is it takes your built artifacts, your jar, your war file, and it will install it or deploy it into a remote repository, such as Artifactory, Archiva, or Nexus. Now this deploy phase is normally only used on a build server such as Jenkins. So for developer workstation, you typically only go as far as the install goal. We learned a few minutes ago that a Maven lifecycle consists of one or more phases. Each phase, in turn, can be mapped to one or more plugin goals, and we just saw some examples of that. So in other words, a plugin goal is said to be bound to a phase. Many plugins have some goals that are by default bound to a given phase in the Maven lifecycle. And you may have seen some of these plugins defined in the POM files of some projects you've worked on. So here's an example. This is the POM file for the serving web content project we've been working on. And here I am looking at the plugin for the Spring Boot Maven plugin, specifically the build info goal. I'm going to go command left mouse click. I'm on a Mac, so I think on Windows it's control left mouse click. And this is going to bring in the plugin.xml file for the Spring Boot Maven plugin. So here I am looking at the build info goal, and I see that it is bound to the generate resources phase. We also saw during our example build the repackage goal got executed within the Spring Boot Maven plugin. This repackage goal, it by default is bound to the package phase. So for a jar or a war file, these are all the phases that Maven will perform and the plugin goals that it will execute. I mentioned earlier that if there's no plugin goal bound to a build phase, then that phase is not executed. The example I used earlier on was the validate phase. We see in this table here that nothing is by default bound to the validate phase, so validate is not executed. We see the process resources phase has the resources goal of the Maven resources plugin bound to it. Compile of the compiler plugin is bound to the compile phase. And similarly for test resources, test compile, test, the package phase has jar or war bound to it. And same thing with install phase, it's got the install goal of the Maven install plugin bound to it. So the beauty of this is in our example, we specified the install goal. And what that did was perform every phase preceding it up to and including the install goal. So it's not necessary for you to specify all of these phases that you want to perform. You just got to specify the last one that you want executed, and Maven will perform all the preceding ones. So for example, if all you wanted to do was run your unit test, you could just go specify the test goal to Maven, so mvn test, and it's going to compile process test resources, do your test compile, perform your unit tests, and it will stop there, assuming there's no compile errors in your source code or your test code. So this is a list of all the phases in the Maven default lifecycle. Again, I mentioned earlier that if there are no goals bound to a given phase, well, that phase is not executed. And just glancing through this list here, we see some of the familiar ones: compile, test, package, install, and so forth. So for example, we saw the validate phase. I mentioned earlier there's no plugin goal is by default bound to it. An example of where you may want to bind something to that phase is if you're using the Maven check style plugin. Suppose your team wants to check the source code for proper indentation, proper spacing, and so forth. Well, you may want to use the Maven check style plugin like this by defining it as a plugin inside of your POM file. Here we specify the Maven check style plugin, group ID, and version. We specify here that we want to run the check goal from the Maven check style plugin and bind that to the validate phase. So what's going to happen there is when in the validate phase, Maven will run the check goal of the Maven check style plugin. So for example, do an MVN clean install. We see here the check style plugin is run, the check goal is run, and we see there's some validation errors, so it stops right there. Some other phases I want to point out here in the default lifecycle, the generate sources phase. Nothing, again, by default is bound to that. But if your team uses map struct to generate mapping code to map from one POJO to another, MapStruct will generate the source code based on the interfaces that you've annotated with MapStruct annotations, and it is in the generate sources phase that MapStruct will generate the source code for you. Generate resources, we saw that earlier with the build info goal of the Spring Boot Maven plugin. Process classes. Now, if you're using Lombok to generate getter and setter methods for POJO classes that you've appropriately annotated, Lombok is going to enhance the bytecode, the compiled bytecode, by generating the getter and setter methods right in there. And that happens in the process classes phase. The rest of these we've seen, most of them. The integration test phase, nothing by default is bound to that. But if you have some longer running integration tests, you may want to use the Maven failsafe plugin and bind that to the integration test to run some of your longer integration tests. So that's the default lifecycle. Here's the clean lifecycle. Again, it's a much smaller one, just 3 phases bound to it, and we've seen that the clean phase is the one that that deletes all the files under your /target directory. I'll put links to all these tables down into the description below. Finally, the site lifecycle. Again, this is the one that generates the project documentation that we saw. For example, the documentation for Maven itself was generated using the Maven site plugin. Well, that is run during the site lifecycle, and you would go MVN site or MVN site deploy to create and generate and deploy that generated documentation. So there you have it, the Maven Build Lifecycle. We talked about the 3 different life cycles. We've seen the phases that comprise each of those life cycles, and we saw how the goals you specify in a Maven run control how much of the life cycle to perform. Thanks for joining me on this video. If you liked it, please hit the thumbs up button down below, leave me a comment to tell me how I did, and subscribe to this channel so you don't miss any new videos. And I'll see you in the next one.